Hello there. Tonight we are going to walk through the cobbled streets of a city that smells like flowers, sweat, and secrets. You're in 17th century Paris. The carriages rattle, the skirts swish, and above it all, quite literally, are the wigs. White, towering, powdered wigs bobbing like clouds across the city square. They're perched on heads like crowns, defiant against the wind and reality. But what you might not know is that under those silky waves and curls, there's often something missing, something patchy, something decaying, something contagious. And let's be real, if you woke up in this world tonight with your Target deodorant and your shampoo that smells like cucumber melon, you probably wouldn't make it past breakfast. So before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you really like what I do here. Drop a comment and let me know where you're listening from and what time it is where you are. Now turn off the lights, maybe turn on the fan for some soothing noise, and let's get started tonight. Picture this. You're standing on the Rue Saint-Honoré, dodging horse droppings and fruit vendors while trying not to breathe too deeply. The air is a cocktail of orange blossom perfume roasting chestnuts, lavender oil, and something vaguely organic in a way you don't want to identify. You pass men with elegant cloaks, walking like they own the cobblestones, and women with cheeks so powdered they practically sparkle in the sunlight. But everyone, and I mean everyone, has a wig. And not just any wig. We're talking meringue-shaped marvels whipped and fluffed to mathematical precision. Some even seem to have birds living in them. Seriously, birds. Just nesting. But don't be fooled. This isn't just some quirky fashion phase. This is armor. This is concealment. This is desperation wrapped in horsehair. Because under those powdered waves lie bald spots, scars, sores, and stories no one wants to say out loud. Let's rewind for a moment. Because powdered wigs didn't always exist. There was a time when hair was just hair. It grew, it thinned, it greased, it fell out, and people mostly dealt with it. But then something happened. A certain illness arrived. One that didn't care if you were a king or a baker or a bishop. One that made your body its playground and your reputation its collateral. But more on that in a bit. For now, just know this: the wig wasn't born out of vanity. It was born out of shame and fear and a frantic need to keep up appearances in a world where your scalp could betray you just as easily as a whisper in court. People started small. A little hairpiece here, a thick braid stitched in there. But before long, subtle wasn't enough. What was once a quiet fix turned into a loud announcement. Look at me. I'm not sick. I'm not scandalous. I'm someone important. The bigger the wig, the better the lie. Wigs didn't just sit on heads, they told stories. About class, about cleanliness, about who you were allowed to be. And you didn't just throw one on, you powdered it. Lavender-scented starch. Sometimes violet, sometimes blue. You fluffed it and pinned it, and maybe added a ribbon if you were feeling cheeky. The goal wasn't realism, the goal was spectacle, and it worked. Within a few decades, you couldn't walk into a royal court without seeing a forest of wigs. Some scraped the top of the carriage doors, others tilted dangerously in the wind. There's one unconfirmed but persistent legend about a duchess whose wig was so tall it caught fire on a chandelier. She survived. The wig didn't. But that's how serious this was. If your wig was too small, you risked looking poor or worse, diseased. If it was too big, you might need a support structure under your hat. Fashion wasn't just uncomfortable. It was exhausting. And people didn't question it. No one turned to the man next to them and asked, "Hey, why are we all wearing these giant hair clouds?" Because that would be like asking why everyone's wearing pants. It was just the rule. What they didn't say, at least not out loud, was that under many of those wigs were the signs of something far more terrifying. Because this was a time when medicine still thought letting out blood might fix your fever, when nobody really understood germs or infection, or why one minute you had a few spots and the next your nose was falling off. And once people started losing hair in suspicious patterns, no one wanted to be the one with the visible proof. Because baldness wasn't just a cosmetic issue, it was moral. If you were missing hair, people didn't think, genetics. They thought scandal, or sin, or something contagious. And so the hair had to be replaced, covered, faked. Thus began a quiet epidemic of wigs, each one hiding a patch of skin that might tell too much truth. But there's something else no one talks about. Wigs weren't exactly comfortable. They were hot. They itched. They smelled. Especially on a summer day when your royal robes were already clinging to you like wet curtains. You'd be sweating under a pound of starched goat hair, trying to pretend like your scalp wasn't staging a revolt. But the alternative, letting people see the truth, that was unthinkable. Even the clergy got in on the action. Priests in powdered wigs, judges, doctors, people who should have known better, or maybe they knew exactly what they were hiding, and the wig was just part of the ritual. And here's the oddest detail of all: people started to miss the feel of their own hair. There are diaries, real ones, where noblemen write about sneaking home and taking their wigs off, running their hands over the bare stubble underneath, like they were touching a forbidden secret. Some even named their wigs, gave them personalities. One baron in Bavaria had 3 wigs, one for court, one for dinner, and one for private reflections. Make of that what you will. What historians still debate is when exactly the wig went from being a private fix to a public phenomenon. Some say it was the court of Louis XIII. Others argue it wasn't until Louis XIV made baldness fashionable by pretending he wasn't bald at all. What no one debates is this: once the powdered wig took hold, there was no turning back. So the next time you see an oil painting of a man in a white curly bouffant, don't just think fancy. Think survival. Think social camouflage. Think, please don't notice the sores behind my ear, because that's where our story really begins. You can almost hear it, can't you? The clatter of boots on marble, the rustle of silk brushing against stone, the soft tap of a cane marking time through a hallway. And somewhere under all of that, just beneath the polite laughter and the rustling fans, is the one thing no one will speak of: illness. Specifically, a disease so feared, so whispered about, that even its symptoms became fashionably taboo. Syphilis. Yes, I know. Not exactly bedtime material. But let's ease into it gently, shall we? By the late 1400s, syphilis arrived in Europe like an uninvited guest who breaks all your furniture and refuses to leave. No one knew where it had come from. Some blamed sailors returning from the New World, others suspected divine punishment. What they did know, and quickly, was that this disease didn't just hurt. It transformed. It started innocently enough. A rash here, a sore there, maybe a bit of fever or fatigue. But then came the real horror. Faces pocked and hollowed, noses collapsing into themselves, limbs trembling and joints ballooning, and the hair, it fell. Not gracefully, not all at once, in cruel little patches, as if the body itself were peeling away the identity of its owner. There were no antibiotics, no Tylenol, no clinical trials. You had leeches, mercury, and prayer. Doctors, if we're feeling generous with that term, prescribed concoctions that included things like crushed emeralds, roasted pig fat, and occasionally a dab of arsenic for flair. Some believed you could sweat the sickness out in steam chambers so hot the attendants had to drag the patients out unconscious. Others thought bloodletting would draw out the bad humors, as though the disease was just a case of melancholy overstaying its welcome. But here's the worst part. The worst wasn't the pain. It wasn't even the disfigurement. It was the shame. Because syphilis was associated with sex, and that meant it wasn't just a medical condition. It was a moral stain. To have syphilis was to be unclean, ungodly, undesirable. You could be the wealthiest count in Champagne, and one bald patch was enough to send servants whispering behind your back. Because people didn't understand infection. They understood consequence. And to lose your hair was to lose your innocence, at least in the eyes of society. Which brings us back to the wig. Imagine you're a gentleman at court. You've spent your youth enjoying the liberties of noble birth, hunting, gambling, maybe some less than sanctioned adventures behind velvet curtains. And now at 33, your hairline is retreating faster than your armies. You notice sores that don't heal. Your valet starts avoiding eye contact. And you realize you're becoming visible. So what do? You shave your head. You commission a wig. And just like that, your shame is covered in curls and powder and the soft scent of bergamot. You walk back into court not as a cautionary tale, but as a vision of elegance. The lie is seamless. Almost. But not everyone could afford that escape. Wigs weren't cheap, especially the good ones. They had to be handmade often from human hair and styled with hot irons, wax, and pomade. The best were imported. The rest were scavenged, sometimes quite literally, from the dead. There are accounts, murky, debated, but too delicious not to share, of wig makers paying grave robbers for fresh hair. As one French proverb from the era goes, the finer the wig, the fresher the scalp. So while the nobility pranced around with voluminous bouffants, the poor had to make do. Scarves, bonnets, hoods, anything to hide the signs. But even that wasn't enough to stop the questions. Because people didn't just look at you, they scanned you. Every blemish became a clue. Every cough, every flinch, a potential scandal. And that paranoia, it infected everyone. There were whisper networks in every court-coded language for those who were in decline. People learned to recognize symptoms the way modern teenagers memorize celebrity gossip. Did you see how pale the Viscount looked? I heard Lady Argent covers her mirrors. They say the Duke's nose is soft now. It's funny in a dark sort of way, how fear can breed fashion. The early wigs were modest, just enough to suggest fullness, with curls clustered at the temples and tied at the back. But as the disease worsened and more scalps needed concealing, the wigs grew. Taller, wider, whiter. The powder helped cover stains. The scent helped mask the smell. And before long, the wig wasn't just a tool. It was a symbol. The absurd part, the same disease that sent people into hiding, also made them more visible. A man who might have faded quietly into illness now strode into court with a literal crown of hair. His baldness, his suffering hidden, but his status elevated. It's as if society said, if you're going to rot, at least rot beautifully. And yes, historians still debate whether syphilis was the primary reason wigs became mainstream. Some argue that fashion always needs an excuse, and this was just a convenient one. Others point to portraiture trends, shifting ideals of masculinity, and even the influence of Eastern styles through trade. But let's be honest, when a whole generation suddenly starts hiding their heads behind sculpted fiber, something deeper is probably going on. Besides, the timing fits too well. By the mid-1600s, wigs weren't just accepted, they were expected. And syphilis, it was everywhere. Some estimates say up to a third of adults in urban centers showed signs of infection. That's not a footnote. That's a pandemic. A slow, festering one with no end in sight. And so the wig became armor. It was medicine's failure rebranded as style. A public health crisis turned into a runway. People took the very thing that was meant to mark them and flipped the narrative. No, I'm not diseased, they seemed to say. I'm fashionable. In a way, that's the most human thing about all of this. The need to pretend. To transform pain into poetry. To take a rotting truth and wrap it in ribbon and lace and lavender until even you can't tell what's underneath. And if that doesn't help you sleep tonight, well, wait until you meet the teenager who turned his own hair loss into a nationwide obsession. He's coming. He's radiant. And he's very, very bald. There's something oddly comforting about the idea that even kings get insecure about their hairlines. I mean, if Louis XIV of France could look in the mirror at 15 years old, panic over a receding hairline, and decide the only solution was global fashion domination, then maybe we're all just doing our best. But let's not get ahead of ourselves. When Louis XIV was still just a moody teenager, France was in a bit of a mess. Plagues, civil unrest, nosy nobles. It wasn't exactly a great time to be king, even less so when your crown was sitting atop a head that was shedding faster than a molting goose. And in a court obsessed with appearances, every strand mattered. Louis had been raised to believe that kings don't just rule. They perform. Every step, every outfit, every glance in a gilded mirror was part of a carefully orchestrated ballet of power. And nothing disrupted that performance quite like a bald spot. He could have ignored it. Worn a hat? Gone minimalist? Instead, he went full drama. He didn't just get a wig. He created a wig dynasty. Louis XIV employed at one point up to 48 full-time wig makers. That's not a typo. 48. Men and women whose sole job was to manage the hair he didn't have. Their workshops became hair laboratories experimenting with textures, powders, heights, and curl patterns. Some wigs were designed for war, others for balls. Some were so heavy he had to lean his head a certain way when he wore them. You might be tempted to laugh. A teenage boy losing his hair and throwing a royal tantrum with wigs. But remember, Louis wasn't just any boy. He was the Sun King, the absolute monarch of the most powerful court in Europe. His image was France's image, and he knew it. Every portrait of him shimmered with gold and power. Rays of light burst from his likeness. His heels were high, his legs on display, his stare fixed somewhere above your head. And always, always the hair, cascading, powdered, gravity-defying, like a lion who'd just stepped out of a cloud. And people noticed. What historians still debate is whether Louis wore the wigs to cover up signs of syphilis. There's no hard evidence of him having the disease, but the timing lines up. His court was riddled with rumors, with secrets, and his obsession with cleanliness, with theatrical grooming, with absolute visual control, it fits the pattern. What's undeniable is the ripple effect. The moment Louis embraced the wig, everyone else followed. Nobles, advisors, courtiers, even foreign dignitaries began adjusting their appearances to match. To be seen without a wig at Versailles, unthinkable. Like showing up barefoot to the Oscars. And it wasn't just about looking good. It was about belonging. Wearing the wig meant you were in, that you understood the performance, that you bowed to the same illusions. And of course, the wigs got bigger. Because this is fashion we're talking about. And fashion doesn't plateau, it escalates. Soon, men's wigs came in categories. The full-bottomed wig, for instance, was so large it made your head look like it was being slowly devoured by a powdered jellyfish. There was the sta or milli wig, with braids and black ribbon. The cote wig, a little more practical, favored by military men. And for those not bold enough for full wigs, there were hair patches. Think of them as 17th century toupees glued into place with pig fat and hope. Let's pause here for a second. Pig fat, that was a real thing. People used it to affix hair pieces to their scalps. And sometimes when the weather was warm, it melted. There are letters, genuine aristocratic correspondence, complaining about the horror of having one's wig slip into the soup. Fashion is pain, especially when it's sliding down your forehead. But back to Louis. By the time he hit his 30s, the wig wasn't just his shield. It was his brand. He wore them with pride, with choreography. He even had special wig hours in his daily schedule, moments when attendants would brush perfume and adjust his hairpieces like they were crown jewels. And the public followed suit. The French economy adapted to support the wig craze. Wig makers became celebrities. There were catalogs, trends, knockoffs. If Louis added a new twist to his curls within weeks, Paris was imitating it. And within months, so was London, Vienna, even Rome. It was the first time a hairstyle had crossed borders, not as a cultural exchange, but as a political statement. To wear a wig in the style of Louis XIV was to say, I align myself with power, with taste, with supremacy. But wigs weren't just reserved for the nobility anymore. Wealthy merchants joined in. High-ranking soldiers, judges, diplomats. The courts began mandating wigs as part of formal dress. And if you couldn't afford a proper one, well, too bad. You'd be left out visibly and humiliatingly. So what started as a teenager's solution to hair loss became a nationwide hierarchy ranked by ringlets and powder density. And the powder, oh the powder. Some people think all wigs were white, but that's not quite right. The powder came in colors: soft blues, pale violets, dove gray, even delicate pinks for spring social gatherings. The powder wasn't just aesthetic, it served function. It masked any lingering odor, gave texture and volume, and helped style last through long dinners and longer dances. The base for the powder, often rice flour, sometimes crushed bone, or chalk, or starch, occasionally even plaster of Paris, which if you've ever done crafts, you'll know is not scalp-friendly. But no one cared. If it looked good and smelled faintly of lavender and status, it was worth the rash. And remember, this was all still in part about hiding something. Even as fashion took over and the wigs became art, their roots, pun very much intended, were still about concealment. The sores, the scars, the thinning, the shame. There are even stories too good to fact-check, but too eerie to ignore, of nobles who died and requested to be buried with their wigs on. So that I might meet God as I met man, one is rumored to have said. And maybe that's the heart of it. Louis XIV didn't just change hairstyles. He changed how people saw themselves. He turned insecurity into theater, disease into pageantry. And in doing so, he crowned himself not just with power, but with powder. So next time you roll your eyes at a modern influencer doing a hair tutorial, remember, at least they aren't gluing pig fat to their heads. Yet. Let's say you're getting dressed for a royal ball in 1702. You've got your silk breeches, your brocade waistcoat, your tiny dagger, because fashion is all about layers, and of course your wig. But not just any wig. This one is your evening wig. Specially fluffed, delicately curled, lightly scented with lavender, and perhaps just a hint of citrus oil to help you mask the fact that bathing isn't something you do more than once a month. That's not a joke. In this era, bathing regularly was still considered suspicious by some and entirely impractical by others. Water was believed to carry disease into the skin, not rinse it away. So instead of shampoo and soap, people relied on powders, perfumes, and wigs, lots of wigs. And the more fragrant, the better. By this point in history, wigs had become little ecosystems of hygiene theater. Beneath those powdered curls lay shaved scalps, because yes, people really did start shaving their own heads under the wigs. It made things easier to wear, easier to clean, and critically easier to de-louse. Because lice, dear listener, were everywhere. In your bedsheets, in your clothes, on your children, and especially in your hair. And unlike the pests we occasionally worry about now, these lice were robust, resilient, and extremely democratic. They didn't care if you were a peasant or a princess. They came for you all the same. So Wigs, ironically, became a kind of anti-lice technology. You could boil a wig. You could brush it, air it, powder it, perfume it. You couldn't do that to your scalp, not without consequences. So you shaved your head, wore a wig, and pretended you'd just come from the salon, not the apothecary. It was genius, really. Disgust cloaked in dignity. And then came the powders. White was fashionable, sure, but powder wasn't always white. There were pastel purples, pale greens, pale blue for men attending spring court, and sometimes, if you were particularly daring, pink. Imagine that a room full of powdered men in delicate shades of baby blush and mint mist, all trying to look aloof and powerful, while constantly sneaking glances to make sure their wig wasn't sliding off from the humidity. The powders were made of rice flour starch and sometimes bone ash. Some were even mixed with chalk or lead-based materials, which, as you might guess, didn't do wonders for skin or lungs. Still, the goal was scent and volume. Powders were often blended with dried herbs, or concentrated essential oils. Lavender was a classic, but rosemary, bergamot, or even cinnamon made appearances in the right circles. There was also rose powder, often saved for funerals. Mourning didn't mean you stopped styling after all. It just meant you toned down the lilac and added some solemnity. And don't be fooled into thinking these rituals were only for men. Women wore wigs too, and they were often even more extravagant. Towering constructions that required hidden scaffolding, metal pins, internal padding, and sometimes a servant or two to steady the weight. There are unverified stories of women getting stuck in doorways because their wigs were too wide or needing to kneel just to fit inside a carriage. Sounds ridiculous, right? But here's the thing. Those wigs weren't just accessories. They were signals. In a world where your worth was measured by how effortlessly you floated through discomfort, the bigger your wig, the more serene you looked beneath it, the more untouchable you became. And the maintenance, that was an art form all its own. Wigs had to be styled and maintained regularly. There were special combs and brushes. Wigs were steamed, dusted, and refreshed with powder blends stored in delicate paper cones. Some households had entire cabinets dedicated to wig care drawers labeled by scent or season. And like any good fashion item, wigs traveled. You brought them with you to your summer estate, to the opera, to war even. There are letters from officers requesting replacement wigs for battlefield inspections, because you may be covered in mud and blood, but heaven forbid your curls fall flat. Even Marie Antoinette, before she became a symbol of everything wrong with the monarchy, was famous for her towering hairstyles. Legend has it, she once wore a wig so elaborate it included a miniature model of a ship complete with sails, rigging, and tiny painted sailors. Historians still debate whether that actually happened, or if it was revolutionary propaganda, but either way, it tells you what wigs had become. Theaters. Fashion no longer stopped at the collarbone. Now your hair, or what appeared to be hair, was a canvas for your social script, and the more ridiculous it got, the more important you seemed. But remember, under all the powder, perfume, and flourishes, most people were just trying to hide something. A scar, a bald spot, a scab that wouldn't heal, a reminder of a night they couldn't quite remember. Wigs became a kind of privacy screen in public life, and no one dared look behind the curtain. There were even unspoken etiquette rules. You didn't touch someone's wig. You didn't ask about it. And you certainly didn't mention if it shifted during supper. To draw attention to a wig was to flirt with scandal. So everyone played along. It created a strange kind of intimacy, too. Lovers wrote about unpinning each other's wigs in quiet moments. Husbands sometimes never saw their wives without hair. A stolen glance at a bare scalp was considered deeply private, almost erotic in its vulnerability. And through it all, the wigs kept growing. They grew taller, more ornate, more fragrant. Whole salons were devoted to them. Recipes were passed down. Powder scents were personalized. Some wigs were even given names. And why not? If you're going to spend more time with your wig than your cousin, it deserves a name. There's something bittersweet about it all, don't you think? This entire system, so elaborate, so theatrical, so utterly absurd, was born not from fashion, but from fear. The fear of disease, the fear of shame, the fear of being seen too clearly. And yet in hiding, people found identity. In concealing, they found expression. In covering their flaws, they created an entire era's definition of beauty. That's the thing about history. The stories we tell on the surface are rarely the full truth. Sometimes they're just powdered versions of it, softened, scented, styled. But if you're willing to peel back the curls, lift the lace, and look a little deeper, you'll find something messier, something human. And next, we're going to talk about the true absurdity of the wig, how its size became a form of status so ridiculous that even gravity gave up. By now, you've probably got the picture. Wigs weren't just fashionable, they were functional. They were scented, styled, steamed, and sculpted. But something curious started to happen. As the wig craze spread across Europe, they began to grow. Not metaphorically, literally, and not just a little. By the mid-18th century, some wigs were so tall, so heavily powdered, so elaborately adorned, that walking through a doorway required choreography. Bows had to be deeper, chairs had to be redesigned, and don't even think about windy days or sitting near an open flame. It was the age of the spectacle wig. What started as a cover-up for illness had now mutated into a towering, feathered, bejeweled competition for who could carry the biggest architectural marvel on their head without toppling over. You think I'm joking? I'm not. Wigs had grown so big, so outrageous, that they became entire visual narratives. A woman might wear a wig shaped like a pastoral scene, complete with faux sheep and paper flowers. Another might choose a miniature sailing ship with rigging that quivered when she walked. One notorious style even incorporated a working bird cage complete with a live bird chirping away just above the left temple. You can imagine the bird didn't enjoy formal banquets nearly as much as the hostess did. But let's not let the whimsy distract us. Because the absurdity, it wasn't just for laughs. There was a very real logic twisted, as it may be, behind this madness. You see, the bigger the wig, the bigger the lie it could hide. The larger the curls, the more surface area you had to cover. Underneath those voluminous styles could be anything: untreated infections, scar tissue discoloration, even tumors. And in an age where illness was not only feared, but demoralized, concealment meant survival. But it also meant control. When you couldn't speak openly about disease, especially venereal disease, which came tangled in scandal and whispers, you learned to communicate through fashion. And fashion, in this case, became armor. A tall wig didn't just declare wealth or style. It declared dominance. It said, "I am untouchable." Even if you were quietly falling apart beneath the powder, the world would only see your majesty. And of course it caught on. Soon, European courts were flooded with high-haired men and women, all competing in a quiet arms race of curls and creativity. Bigwig wasn't a metaphor yet. It was a literal descriptor. If you had a job that required a big opinion, a judge, a barrister, a member of parliament, you wore a condiment. Bigwig. The size of your hairpiece was proportionate to the size of your authority. The English judicial system still retains this relic. Judges in certain courts continue to wear powdered wigs, a quiet, curly nod to an era when law was as much about performance as it was about justice. But back in the 1700s, things were getting a little unstable. Wigs especially, The giant ones were expensive to maintain, and wear. They required teams of hairdressers, intricate pinning systems, and constant refreshing. A man of means might own half a dozen wigs, one for court, one for hunting, one for mourning, one for receiving guests, and of course his favorite, the promenade wig. The one that caught the sunlight just right. The one that made passing strangers nod with quiet admiration. Women, too, had entire cabinets just for storing their hairpieces. Some styles required sleeping upright, supported by pillows to keep the wig from collapsing overnight. And if you think sleeping on your back with a birdcage strapped to your skull sounds romantic, you'd be wrong. Elegant, yes. Comfortable, no. But perhaps the strangest aspect of all this was how much people believed in the wig. Not just as a trend, but as a solution. They believed the wig made them safer, more desirable, more powerful. And in some ways, it did. We have diaries from the era that reveal how people felt. More confident stunk in their wigs. They stood straighter. They spoke louder. They flirted more boldly. The wigs became a kind of fantasy extension, a personality enhancer, and yet underneath nothing had changed. The sores were still there. The thinning hair. The aching joints. The hidden shame of a disease that no one dared name in public. Which is what makes all this so sad and so fascinating. Because for all their extravagance, wigs were still just distractions. Beautiful ones. Clever ones. But distractions all the same. They turned the human head into a stage, and everyone became both performer and audience. You could say they were the first influencers. Fashion historians still debate whether this level of extravagance was more about class anxiety than illness. Some argue the aristocracy used wigs to distance themselves from the rising middle class, those pesky merchants and bankers who were suddenly able to buy land and wear silk. After all, anyone could afford decent clothes, but not everyone could wear a tower of perfumed goat hair without crumbling under its weight. Wigs, in that sense, became a test of endurance. A silent game of how ridiculous can I look while still pretending I'm above you. The answer apparently was there's a letter from a British ambassador who attended a French gala and claimed he had to tilt his head sideways just to kiss a duchess's hand, lest he poke her in the eye with the lace trim on his wig. Another recounts a social incident in Vienna where two women refused to stand near each other because their wigs wouldn't fit side by side in the parlor. These aren't footnotes. These are realities. The wigs dictated everything from architecture to behavior. Ballroom ceilings were raised. Chairs were designed with hollow backs. Carriages were widened. And in portraits, artists often had to invent new proportions just to fit the full hairstyle onto the canvas. But still, people wore them. Day after day. Week after week. The burden became normal. The powder became ritual. And underneath it all, the fear remained. Because if your wig slipped, if your curls sagged, if a patch of bare scalp peeked out beneath the puffed edges, everything could fall apart. A court appointment denied. A marriage proposal revoked. A reputation shattered. It's almost tender, isn't it? This idea that people went to such extreme lengths to feel worthy, to be loved, to be seen not for what they were, but for what they wished to appear. And in the next part, we'll talk about what happened when that illusion started to crack. When the powdered cloud stopped being a mark of nobility and started showing up on blacksmiths, because nothing terrifies the elite more than a commoner with confidence. There's a particular kind of panic that only the rich can feel. It doesn't come from hunger or cold or fear of the dark. It comes from looking across the ballroom, locking eyes with a young man dressed impeccably, powdered wig, embroidered coat, polished boots, and realizing He's the blacksmith's son. And yet, he looks like you. That's what was happening across France, England, and much of Europe by the late 1700s. The wig, once a symbol of the elite, had begun its slow, inevitable descent into the hands and onto the heads of the middle and working classes. You see, fashion is a lot like gossip. Once it leaves the drawing rooms and slips into the streets, everyone wants a piece of it. At first, the noble class was flattered. How charming that the merchants were trying to imitate court life. How quaint. But flattery curdled quickly into fury when it became clear that the lines of class were blurring. The wig, their crown of distinction, was being democratized, stylized, scaled down, copied, and they couldn't stop it. The moment wigs became a product, they became vulnerable. Enterprising artisans began creating cheaper versions, less horsehair, more wool, less imported scent, more kitchen spice. Some wigs were dyed using crushed berries or soot. Others were padded to appear fuller while using less actual material. Blacksmiths wore wigs to church. Butchers wore wigs to festivals. Even apprentices saved up for second-hand hairpieces to wear at public dances. It was chaos. The aristocracy responded the only way they knew how, by escalating. If commoners were going to wear wigs, then by all means, let's make the aristocratic ones even more ludicrous. Taller, whiter, sculpted with themes. Enter the pitopsu poof. This wasn't just a wig. It was a statement piece. Think of it as the red carpet dress of 18th century headwear. Women, especially in the French court, would style their hair and wigs into towering constructions that told stories. Entire narratives, in fact. One famous example, the coiffure à la belle poule. A wig fashioned to display a model of a French warship in honor of a naval victory. It wasn't metaphorical. There was an actual ship on her head, complete with sails and tiny cannons. Another style, the circumpuchoctine, pouf au sentiment. This one was more romantic, depicting perhaps a shepherd's crook, a dove holding a love letter, and a miniature portrait of a beloved tucked near the left temple. There were wigs for weddings, for births, for royal hunts, for political statements. One woman wore a wig to protest the rising cost of bread, styling it like an overflowing basket of baked goods. It was part satire, part performance art, and 100% absurd. But while the nobility kept reaching higher, the real revolution was happening below. The middle class had money now. Not aristocratic money, but enough money. And they spent it wisely. On education, on fabric, on powdered wigs. And they began to act differently too. In salons and coffee houses, merchants and lawyers gathered to discuss ideas. Enlightenment was in the air. Voltaire, Rousseau, Locke all whispered between sips of spiced chocolate and under softly dusted wigs. The hair may have imitated the nobility, but the thoughts underneath were starting to sound revolutionary, literally, and the nobles felt it, the discomfort, the fear, because the wig no longer guaranteed status, no longer ensured deference. It had become a costume. And there's nothing more terrifying than realizing your power is just a piece of theater, one that anyone can buy at the right shop. This is when the term bigwig began to shift in meaning. No longer purely descriptive, it became a kind of gentle mockery. Oh, he thinks he's a bigwig, someone might say, meaning not that the man had authority, but that he thought he did. And language wasn't the only thing shifting. Public trust in the elite was wearing thin. The wigs, once majestic, once aspirational, now felt artificial, pretentious, detached. And worse, they were seen as tools of deception. Remember, many people still believed wigs were worn to hide syphilis. And whether that was true for any individual or not, the rumor had already done its damage. There's a famous moment allegedly in the final days before the French Revolution. when a nobleman walked into a tavern wearing an exquisitely tall, powdered wig and was met with silence. Not admiration, not envy, just a room full of hard stares and clenched jaws. The wig, once a sign of perfection, had become a target. Historians still debate the turning point. Was it economics, ideology, disease, fashion, fatigue? Whatever it was, the commoners no longer looked up. Literally. The wigs had become too tall, too indulgent, too fragile for a world that was starting to feel the cracks beneath its feet. And there's a sad irony here. Because the nobles weren't wrong to feel threatened. Their powdered fortresses had served them well for decades, but they had become too reliant, too separated from the heads they were supposed to represent. And now those heads on the streets and the markets and the salons were starting to whisper, "Why not us?" The blacksmith's son didn't just wear the wig, he owned it, wore it with a different kind of pride. Not the inherited kind, but the earned kind. He stood a little taller, talked a little smarter, danced with the daughters of merchants instead of just watching them. And for a moment, in the flickering candlelight of a provincial ball, he was indistinguishable from the Duke's cousin. And that was revolutionary. Not the guillotine, not the pamphlets, not the chants, but the wig on a common man's head. So as the elite tried to one-up each other with powdered sailing ships and pearl-draped curls, the ground beneath them was shifting. Slowly, irreversibly. And next, we'll watch the wigs go to war. Not in the trenches, but in the courtrooms, the opera houses, and the shadowed hallways of power where a powdered headpiece could still be the sharpest blade in the room. Let's dim the candlelight a bit. We're moving into the late 18th century now, a world trembling on the edge of revolution, where powdered wigs were still towering, still fragrant, still absurd, but also weaponized. Not literally, although that ship wig from last time did look a bit dangerous. No, wigs had become political weapons, cultural minefields, and symbols of a system fraying at the seams. See, somewhere between the nobility's obsession with feathers and the blacksmith's son's rise to promenade-worthy curls, wigs had stopped being just accessories. They had become lines in the sand. You were either wearing one or making a point of not wearing one, and that in a society obsessed with status and visibility was practically a declaration of war. In the salons of Paris, in the courtrooms of London, in the candlelit theaters of Vienna, wigs were as loud as any speech. They were used to mark allegiance, to signal conformity or rebellion. In some circles, choosing to wear a wig that was too modest was its own kind of message, just enough powder to be proper, not so much to be ostentatious. You could tell a man's politics from his curls. Judges and lawyers, especially in Britain, clung to their wigs with desperate pride. These weren't the grand bouffants of Versailles. No birds, no boats. Just stern, pale locks tied back in strict order. The British court wig had become a symbol of tradition, of law, of unyielding structure. Even today, if you squint at legal proceedings in certain courts, you'll still spot them pale, orderly uniform. History perched right there on a sweaty forehead. Back then, however, the court wig wasn't just about law. It was about legitimacy. You wore the wig, you respected the system. You removed the wig, or worse, refused to wear one, and you were a threat to it. That's why in the build-up to the French Revolution, you started to see something quietly radical, bare heads. Yes, in a world obsessed with covering up, some radicals began doing the unthinkable. They showed their actual hair, not powdered, not perfumed, not arranged to mimic nobility, just hair, brown, black, gray, tied back plainly or left loose. It was shocking, and it was intentional. There are letters from that era in which aristocrats write with horror at a merchant who dared attend court unwigged, or a military officer who trimmed his wig into something disgustingly simple. Or worse, a woman who arrived with her natural curls completely unpowdered, like some kind of wild animal. But to the revolutionaries, the message was clear. I am not pretending anymore. This quiet defiance spread through art, through fashion, through gossip, and eventually through politics. Wigs, once a requirement to be taken seriously, were now starting to seem ridiculous, detached, even dangerous. Some revolutionaries went so far as to shave their heads, completely claiming the act symbolized shedding vanity, corruption, and hypocrisy. They wore red caps instead, bonnets rouges, symbols of liberty. The wig was no longer protection. It was a target. And if you were caught in the wrong alley, wearing something too high, too white, too powdered, you might not just be mocked. You might be dragged from your carriage. You might be interrogated. You might disappear. What historians still debate is how much the fall of the wig was caused by fashion fatigue versus ideological rejection. Had the curls simply gotten too big, too hot, too much? Or did the growing hunger for authenticity kill them? It's hard to separate the powder from the politics. But either way, by the end of the 18th century, the wig was in crisis. In America, wigs had never quite taken root in the same theatrical way. The founding fathers wore them. Sure, George Washington famously powdered his own hair to imitate the style, but they were never obsessed. The new republic was anti-aristocracy, anti-monarchy, and increasingly anti-wig. Thomas Jefferson called wigs an emblem of servility. Benjamin Franklin stopped wearing his in France to make a point. This is my hair, this is my head, this is who I am. Wigs were being rebranded not as tools of hygiene, not even as fashion statements, but as costumes of tyranny. And yet there were holdouts. In the courtrooms, in the embassies, in the aging salons of Paris, and the echoing halls of Westminster. There the wigs clung like ghosts, powdered and graying, tidy and dignified, but unmistakably out of time. Still, even as the revolution burned wigs in effigy and snipped the curls from once proud nobles, some people held onto them. Because the wig wasn't just vanity, it was ritual. To remove it was to confront your bare head, your age, your scars, your disease, yourself. And that for many was still too much, so they wore them in private, quietly, at home, or in front of mirrors when no one else was around. Some aristocrats, long after exile, long after surrender, would sit in foreign parlors with a glass of brandy and a wig still perched atop their head. Powdered, brushed, familiar. Not for show, for memory. Because beneath the politics and the powder, beneath the bird cages and the satire, the wig had always been more than just hair. It had been a mask, a shield, a performance. And when that performance finally ended, all that was left was the scalp beneath it. In the next part, we'll watch the curtain fall. Not with fire and guillotine, but with silence. A slow forgetting, and a last lingering curl of powder in the air. By the time the 19th century rolled around, the wig was tired. Not just fraying at the edges, not just out of fashion, it was exhausted. Like an actor who had stayed too long on stage, hitting the same lines, the same gestures, waiting for applause that never came. The world had moved on, and the wig was still powdered. In France, the revolution had made sure of that. Heads had rolled some with wigs still perfectly perched. Powdered curls were now associated with privilege, corruption, decadence. The kind of decadence that could get you thrown in prison or worse on a cart headed for the guillotine. In England, the slow fade was more polite, less bloody, but no less final. The younger generation began favoring natural hair, looser styles, simpler silhouettes. The wild towers of curls from their parents' generation now seemed absurd, outdated, a bit embarrassing. Even in the colonies now forging themselves into nations, the wig had become a relic. George Washington, who never actually wore a wig, had powdered his hair out of duty to fashion. But his successors, they let their hair be. Tousled, tied, combed, but real. The powdered wig had become too French, too theatrical, too not us. What historians still debate is whether the wig ever had a chance in the industrial age. Could it have adapted, streamlined itself into something modern? Some tried, of course. Simpler hairpieces were marketed to balding men. A few politicians clung to their court wigs in ceremonial settings, but the culture had changed. The Enlightenment had brought new values: rationality, clarity, transparency. Suddenly, the idea of covering your head in 3 pounds of perfumed goat hair seemed dishonest, even cowardly. Romanticism. The next great wave embraced authenticity. Wild curls, wind-blown locks, passion and nature and feeling. There was no place for starch in that world. No room for wigs styled like naval battles or funeral wreaths, and so the wig began to vanish, quietly. No protests, no declarations, just a soft disappearance. Wig shops closed one by one. The guilds dissolved. Powder recipes were forgotten. And where once there had been powder clouds in every ballroom, now there was air and silence, and people learning to live in their own hair again, which for many was terrifying. Because remember, the wig wasn't just fashion, it was protection. It had hidden things literal and metaphorical that now sat exposed under open skies and changing lights. Aging men who had once masked their thinning scalps with royal curls now had to walk into public rooms as they were. Women, too, who had spent decades communicating status through vertical volume now had to find new ways to say, "I belong." And then there was the legal world. If you've ever watched a British courtroom drama, you know the wigs persisted. Why? Well, tradition. But more than that, ritual. The courtroom wig isn't about hiding, it's about transforming. A barrister dons the wig not to deceive, but to step into role like putting on a robe or reciting an oath. It's one of the last surviving traces of the powdered age. And even today, there's debate about whether it should continue. Some argue it maintains dignity. Others say it's outdated theater. Still others point out that it just looks itchy. But the ghost of the wig lingers elsewhere too. In language. Big wig. Powder room. Let your hair down. These phrases still echo unaware of the powdered curls from which they came. In costume. Period dramas still bring them back, soft white curls bouncing in candlelight, whispering of politics and powdered lies, and in spirit. Because the wig in its prime wasn't just a silly hat. It was a human reaction to fear, to disease, to social pressure. It was the body's betrayal answered with artifice. It was status stitched together from horsehair and hope, and it was belief. That if you covered the thing you were ashamed of just well enough, no one would ever know. Not your lover, not your rival, not even you. So maybe that's why it's comforting in a strange way to think about wigs. Not because we miss the powder or the perfumed starch, but because we recognize the instinct. We still wear masks, we still perform, we still fix our hair a little higher before walking into rooms that might judge us. We've just swapped goat hair for product, powder for filters, feathers for followers, but the longing underneath, it's the same. So the next time you scroll past a painting, some dignified, noble, pale curls cascading over velvet, don't just see fashion. See fear. See invention. See someone who didn't want to be seen too clearly and found a way not to be. And maybe gently you can whisper a thank you for surviving in the only way they knew how, for performing, for powdering, for reminding us that history is just us in fancier wigs. So now, as the night winds down and the room grows still, Let yourself imagine those powdered halls one last time. The soft tap of heels on stone, the scent of lavender mingling with starch, and everywhere clouds of hair drifting through candlelight like whispers. Each one a mask, a message, a secret. They wore wigs not just to look beautiful, but to survive, to hide illness, to escape judgment, to belong. And while their world vanished long ago, the echoes remain. In phrases we still use, in costumes we still mimic, in insecurities we still carry, sometimes not on our heads, but somewhere deeper. It's okay. Tonight we let it all go. No wigs, no masks, no need to pretend. You're here, safe, resting. You don't have to perform. Close your eyes. Let the powdered clouds fade. Let the powdered people drift softly back into portraits and paintings where they belong. And you just breathe. Tomorrow we'll do it all again. But tonight, you don't have to hide. You can just be